Great. Okay. So I just wanted to thank everyone for bringing me on board for this. I know that my talk may be a bit of a change of pace, given its focus on sort of social science, law, normative evaluative criteria. But I think it's important because as I was doing research for my book, New Laws of Robotics, which is coming out this fall, I was particularly interested in the problem of people being judged automatically, automated decision-making systems. And I'm currently part of a research team primarily centered in Australia that's working on this, the automated decision-making program that's being run by the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. Also, I've been in contact with folks in Taiwan, and I've been following the US development of automated judgments of individuals. And just today, there was an amazing expose published by The Markup, with Julia Angwin's paper, the news she's running, which is on tenant screening and automated disqualification of individuals for housing. And so this question of machines judging humans, I think, is quite important. And the way that it's normatively or legally been dealt with in many scenarios now has been to insist upon either, say, an explanation, a human in the loop, or some forms of review. And we'll get into why that can be difficult given other legal protections of entities that are in charge of or in controlling the relevant algorithms. So I'll just dive in. And again, I'm currently at the University of Maryland, moving to Brooklyn Law School as of July 1st, and at Frank Pasquale on Twitter if anyone wants to engage. I can also try to send you relevant work as well. In a nutshell, what I want to talk about today is waves of algorithmic accountability, complementarity and tension between different forms of algorithmic accountability, particularly because there's been a movement over the past 20 years to make legal systems more algorithmic, to say that that is a way of making decision makers more accountable if they have to describe what they do as being based on a certain set of rules. And sometimes those rules come from economics, sometimes they're more mirroring computer science principles of decision making. But then there's been a backlash against that effort to make accountability mechanisms more algorithmic from those who say that the algorithms themselves have to be held accountable, right? And or the people running or owning those algorithms should be made accountable. And so I'm trying to, in this talk, to embed AI in these political economic narratives, particularly from finance and medicine, and to reconceive narrow AI as, in many cases, a form of intelligence augmentation. We've heard a number of great talks today referring back to Licklider and to other pioneers in this area, of course, our host's work, etc. Now, one of the things to think about here is, in law, one of the questions that often comes up is, do formal rules lead to fairness? It may depend on your conception of the rule of law. Okay, so in some forms of law, in historicist or formalist views would say that the ideal, if not necessary, form of law is that of a rule conceived of as a clear prescription that exists prior to its application that determines appropriate conduct, right, or legal outcomes. Right? So those are two ways of saying, hey, the essence of fairness is really about formalizing what we're doing and making it clear what we're doing. On the other hand, skipped. There's a third conception of the rule of law called a legal process school. And legal process conceptions find the requisites of law necessary for rule of law to be satisfied only if you have these four things, okay? Procedural fairness in development and application of the norms, an internal connection between notions of law and reasonableness, some reasoned elaboration of the connection between pre-existing sources of legal authority and determination of rights and responsibilities in cases, and judicial review as a guarantor of procedural fairness, okay? So this is a much more complicated and I think richer concept or conception of the rule of law. And I think it's important because I think it really dovetails with the many talks we've heard today about the importance of having persons in the loop or about having human-centered AI with augmentation of human abilities. The problem, though, has been for this third conception of legal process and of fairness in law is that legal process is expensive, right? That it's costly in economic terms to provide these independent decision makers to listen to both sides, enabling appeals. That's all costly, and also it's costly in terms of power, right? If you have one entity that just is in charge, you know, they can sort of then really force multiply the nature of their authority by coding it. But to the degree to which they have to have distributed expertise, and I know we had a very good talk earlier today about expertise and the nature of expertise with relationship to these systems, then that very distribution of expertise to lower levels of decision makers is a sacrifice of some power, right? Unless you have them completely under control, but that's rare. It's rare to be able to completely control everyone. So we've seen a turn to simpler algorithms, complex data processing, and scoring. And I'll give two examples in my talk. One is, say, hospital rating and ranking, right? If you had sort of a legal efforts to determine the nature of or the quality of hospitals in the past may have involved inspectors going to individual hospitals and examining, say, how people are doing, et cetera, and doing all sorts of qualitative and sometimes quantitative measurements. But there's been a lot of pressure to have just numerical outcome measures based on the data produced by the hospital. For example, excess mortality rate, how many more times do people die during surgery than in average entities, as risk adjusted, right? As adjusted by the complexity of the case, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the problem, though, is that this scoring on one level seemed to be more fair than just having diverse inspectors going out and each perhaps having slightly varying conceptions of quality. The problem, though, is that the rating systems themselves had varying conceptions of quality. And so an article in Health Affairs about things like best hospitals, US News, et cetera, said that national hospital rating systems shared few common scores and may generate confusion. And if you'd like a humorous example of this, Brian Kernighan has a very nice editorial in the Daily Princetonian basically saying that you could develop college rankings that could make almost any college be the #1 in the country. And for a really ridiculous example, there's one law school that's actually one of the very troublingly bad law school in many metrics, but says that it's actually second best in the country because it has the second most students. Okay, so and that's a bit reductio ad absurdum. But I think the question, though, becomes scoring. Has been empirically studied and sometimes questioned. The first wave of algorithmic accountability that I've described in a blog post that I'll get to in a bit is essentially trying to make sure that these systems are fairer and that they incorporate more and better indicators. But there's a second wave of algorithmic accountability that I think is quite important, and that questions the role of scoring systems in general. So this is an image of a screenshot from a game that ProPublica developed, actually about 7 years ago now, called Heart Saver. And in the game, this is one of these persuasive games that Ian Bogost and others have described. In this game, your goal was to take someone who had a heart attack and get them to a hospital in time for them to be saved. And the point of the game, the nature of its persuasion or educative impact, was that this was much easier to do in parts of Manhattan, which are much wealthier than the parts of Queens and the Bronx, where a lot of hospitals have been closed. Now, one aspect of why hospitals close is because they get a bad reputation, right? So if we think about ranking and rating systems as being ways of informing consumers, and we just think that markets are supposed to be allocating goods and that informed consumers are always better, then we might say, thank goodness, it's good that all those bad hospitals in Queens and the Bronx closed down. However, there's another side of the story which would say this seems to be reinforcing dynamics of stratification and exclusion. And it's something that I was writing about many years ago with respect to pandemic preparedness, right? Who is even thinking about, for example, the role of having many hospitals and distributed hospital systems in the midst of, say, a massive surge of need? And so this is just a way of thinking that perhaps we need to go beyond trying to make ranking and rating systems fairer to thinking about what is the social context that they play into, what are the existing advantages and disadvantages that they either reinforce or challenge. And of course, these are familiar concepts in both sociology and computer science, right? In sociology, you have Campbell's law, which says that the more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision-making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures. And we have Goodhart's law, right? I cite the Mannheim and Garabrandt paper about variants of Goodhart's law, that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And so these are problems that come up as well in many of these contexts where gaming becomes the issue, right? And again, to double back to what I was saying earlier about risk adjustment, if you're afraid of gaming, you may do risk adjustment. You can do other things to try to stop it. But at least in my experience in talking with folks at Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation and other healthcare regulators who are trying to ensure that these sort of more quantitative judgment systems are refined, there's a lot of problems there, because the more you do risk adjustment, the more you also spark the development of consultancies and other entities that are capable of devising ways to get past the risk adjustment. So for example, in Well, actually, I'll give the, if I have time and questions, I'll give an example about accountable care organizations because I think it's a very useful one. But I want to go on to finance. Oh yeah, just one other thing too, that this is something to consider as ratings expanded healthcare. I have on this chart the raters and the rated. The raters are on the top, along the top, and the rated is the first column. You can see that like patients and doctors and hospitals, insurers are all engaged in different entities of rating one another. And on the one hand, this can be taken as very useful data to feed into systems in order to help us understand the quality of any of these particular entities. On the other hand, it can be used for surveillance and control, or it can also be manipulated. And, you know, for example, YouTube view counts are a classic example of something that has been manipulated a lot in the past. Now, for finance, I want to give you an example of fintech and algorithmic lending, okay? So we have lots of very good books on predatory lending, on problems of predatory credit. And in this example, one thing that I would wonder is, you know, are the algorithms that are behind a lot of algorithmic lending, are they capable of effectively encompassing all of the social problems that might be sparked by certain forms of algorithmic lending? So for example, in this example, you know, someone might take out a 35% APR loan. They could be desperate to repay it, not buy food for their children, fall behind, but the lender is paid back in full. My sense is that in general, the AI of finance, the narrow AI driving a lot of fintech, would say this is a success, right? And would say also, to the extent that it used different characteristics of Joe to find that person via what's called lead generation online, that the lead generation should find more people like that, right? Now, how do we solve that? Well, one issue could be we want more data about individuals, right? And but then the question becomes, if we get this data, is it a fair deal? So for example, in fintech, a lot of their whole rationale for bringing in more and more data to credit decisions is we want to give credit to people that have a thin credit file, a thin traditional file of repayment history. So imagine that you have a fintech firm that gives a person a chance to obtain credit on good terms if it allows it to download and analyze all information on their mobile phone and resell the data, okay? And the person doesn't know what is done with the data and cannot find out due to trade secrecy. That was the theme of my book, The Black Box Society. You really don't know what's happening to a lot of your data. There are people there are promises that are made. They're not really very well enforceable, and they're not, it's very hard to even find out if they have been respected. And so therefore, you know, another element of this is that in our quest to improve these systems, we need to be sure that we do, I think, a new deal for data and a better deal for data. Here are other tools of evaluation and credit, right? These first two are already in use. Privacy International was reported on the first two. If lenders see political activity on someone's Twitter account in India, they'll consider repayment more difficult, not lend to them, okay? One firm looks at how you write in a form, okay? The first example I would say is politically subordinating, and it should be outlawed for that reason, that we do not want that type of data or those types of effective punishment of individuals via machine learning done because of the possibility of that, because of the subordinating impact of basically letting people know that you're going to be punished if you engage in political activity. That's subordinating. The second is that one firm analyzes the way you fill out a form. I am a bit up in the air about that. I'd love to hear people's thoughts and questions. I mean, one thing that's been speculated is that if you fill out a form in all caps, that, you know, you somehow are an excitable person. You know, so there are ways in which you could try to explain this. And this is something that I was just thinking about with respect to the last presentation is, you know, is it an explanation of the system itself of what it's doing, or are we looking for explanations of that are just plausible, right? And is plausibility enough? And I think that we actually have to go for the former as opposed to the latter. The final example is that there was a very good paper by, I think, Eric Horvitz and others on predicting Parkinson's via mouse tremors, okay, people searching for things in their mouse moving. And that would be very troubling if that were to be used for, say, finance decisions. I'll speed up a little bit. I know that I don't want to go over time. With respect to data and bias, accuratism, an ideology that I've called accuratism, frames the answer to bias as always looking for more data, right? That if we only had more data, we could avoid making these bad decisions. But, you know, my examples that I've just given, I think, show that sometimes more data is not the answer, that it's troubling. And certainly the works of Kiara Bridges and Virginia Eubanks, these are very lengthy treatments that essentially, I think, dispute the idea that getting more and more data about, say, the vulnerable, about the impoverished, about others who are sort of dependent on the state, that will actually help them. And it shows, in fact, the ways in which they are punished by that. To summarize the forms of financial inclusion that I criticized here, they are predatory, creepy, and subordinating. Okay, I think that whenever data is used to evaluate persons automatically, that is either creating situations where they are undergoing extreme distress to repay, or that there is creepy inclusion that could include sort of 360 surveillance upon them, or subordinating to say that you have to engage in activity that maintains or entrenches one's subordinate status, such as not engaging in political advocacy for oneself. These are troubling versions of financial inclusion, and I think it's very hard for existing computing systems to recognize them. I think you need to have persons who have some sociological, social scientific, other forms of expertise in the loop there to recognize those forms of financial inclusion. Some of the problems and the solutions are on this slide. With respect to predatory inclusion, you could have usury law. With respect to creepy, you could have data limits. With respect to subordinating, you can have certain rules about the credit. But the last thing I would say about that last example is that to the extent that you say that you can't have certain forms of correlation based on these forms of subordinating inclusion, then you might throw a wrench into any plans for inexplicable AI. And I think the more legal standards are there for the nature of financial evaluation, the more we effectively are hemming in the role of non-explicable AI. I recently co-authored an article with Kristen Johnson and Jennifer Smith looking at the implications of that for AI finance. This is all about rival narratives as well, right? The rival narratives in credit scoring are, one says that it's a fair allocation of credit according to risk, and that you can redeem yourself as a deadbeat via an opportunity to rebuild your credit score. But the opposite side says, no, actually, this whole system is really built upon subordination of the disadvantaged, rationalized by algorithm, and a machine for generating stigmatic harms that enable profit, such as higher interest rates. Now, I'm not saying one of these is true and one is false, but what I am saying is that we've got to hold both narratives in mind as we develop policy for machines judging humans. The problem here is, and just my second to last slide, is that formal evaluative criteria cannot often accommodate these rival narratives, right? They tend to be driven toward maximizing or satisfying a metric and rule-based. And that's why, citing the very recent work of Salome Viljoen and Ben Green called algorithmic realism, AI may need algorithmic realism the way law needed legal realism. And the bottom line of that is that law in the early 20th century tried to demonstrate its autonomy by saying, we have rules and we can apply these rules to reality and we can order reality and we don't need any input from anybody else. We don't need social science. We don't need philosophy. We're getting rid of that's all old stuff. Law now is going to give social certainty to you. And what Green and Viljoen say in a very interesting argument is they say, well, the history of legal scholarship since the 1920s has been disputing that idea, or at least since the 1910s, 20s, and onward, and saying, boy, law needs economics, law needs a lot of social science, law needs a lot of other forms of expertise to get involved. And their proposal with algorithmic realism is to say that the same, if we're aware of the intellectual history of law's development, we should see a similar type of intellectual history within AI and algorithms that would bring in more of these viewpoints of view. So that would involve, on the second half of this, rethinking metrics, rethinking data collection, discretion to make or change rules. It's part of a larger AI debate. We've already heard about some of these works being cited already. The ones on the left are sort of more about looking at substitutive AI. The ones on the right looking more at the opportunities for our working together with AI. And my bottom line is just to say that, I've been trying to work on these ideas for at least a decade. A few of my works that have been published are on the left-hand side. But I try to bring it all together in the book that's coming forward, and I really look forward to hearing your thoughts both on this presentation and just further dialogue between computer science and law. So thanks so much.